Good evening. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Ella says shalom. Yitzhak in Minnesota. Aoife in Florida. Marjorie in Georgia. Mickey in Vineland, New Jersey. And William in Glendale. Margot in Ontario. Karen in Northern California, Stephen in New Hampshire, Joan in the Inland Empire, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bill in Mid-Missouri, John in Maine, Paula in Chicago, Shandor in the Bronx, Bella, Shalom from Venice, Leona checking in from Illinois, Franco in Trieste, Lucy in Minnesota, David in South Bend, Susie, I think I said in California, Bella in Florida, Margot in Ontario, and Joseph in Massachusetts. Welcome, everybody. How's it going? Very colorful daf. Let's get into it. We are in chapter 2, continuing our discussion of Mishna number 3. Basic idea is that a bill of divorce, can be written on almost anything, with almost any kind of ink, almost any kind of paper. Just has to be clear that you are intending to get divorced. Continuing this discussion, we pick it up near the top of page 20a. Rav Hisda says, if a bill of divorce was written not for her sake. Now, this we've encountered over and over and over again. A bill of divorce cannot be generic, cannot be template, cannot be repurposed. If somebody else with the same names as the husband and the wife wrote a bill of divorce and didn't use it, and then we're going to give it to this couple, since they happen to have the same names, they're going to save a few bucks and not have a scribe write their own bill of divorce. No, it has to be written for that particular couple, by that particular husband, for his particular soon-to-be ex-wife. And if it wasn't written for her sake, then it will not be a valid bill of divorce. So Rav Hisda says, if a bill of divorce was written not for her sake, and the scribe passed over it with a reed pen, meaning that he wrote on top of what was already written, and now the new writing is for her sake, then we have arrived at the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis. Now, interesting, they're not saying that they're going to cross out, it's two totally different names. They're going to cross out the old names and write in the new names, and that's what's going to make it okay. But rather that it was not written for her sake, but it was written for the exact same names. And now, because we know that that is not a valid get, the scribe is just going to go over it one more time with fresh ink. It's going to look the same, but now he's going to have the intention to write it for her sake. Is that going to be valid? So says the Gemara, now we have arrived at the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis. This is from a different area of the law. This is about a sofer, a scribe, writing a Torah scroll or some other bit of scripture. As it is taught in a Baraisa, if a scribe that was writing a Torah scroll was at a point in the text that he needed to write the name of God, and we're talking about the 4-letter name of God that is spelled Yud, He, Vav, He, and he erred, and he intended, and he erred, he made a mistake, and he intended to write Yehuda. Now Yehuda, the name Yehuda, Judah, is, and it's one of the 12 tribes, right? Yehuda, and this is the tribe that from whom King David is a descendant of Yehuda. This is the tribe that sort of received the kingship within it. So Yehuda is spelled almost exactly the same way as the name of God, right? God's name is Yud He Vav He. Yehuda is Yud He Dalid Vav He. So it just has the extra letter Dalid in it. So here's a scribe, and he's writing a Torah, and he needs to write the name of God, Yud He Vav He. And for whatever reason, he makes a mistake. And he thinks that he's supposed to write Yehuda in that spot. But then he compounds his error, and intending to write Yehuda, he's going to actually write God's name. So because of the double mistake, he ends up putting God's name where God's name was supposed to be. However, he was intending to write Yehuda. So his intention was not the correct intention. He didn't mean to write God's name. He meant to write a name of a person, but he misspelled the name of the person and ended up writing God's name without the proper intention. So, is this a valid Torah scroll? So he did not place the dalet in the word and thereby unintentionally writing the name of God in the correct place. Then, right, according to this Baraisa, what he should do is write over it again. Now he should just, he's got God's name in the right place. So what he's going to do is he's going to write it again, write a new layer of ink on top of the old ink. But now, this time, he knows he has to write God's name there. And as he traces over God's name that was written in mistake before, now he's doing it with the proper intention. And in this way, he sanctifies it with the intention that he is writing the name of God. This is the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. And the rabbis say, right, the majority who disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, that even if he adds a second layer of ink, the name has not been written in the optimal manner. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, one can supply the intention of writing the name of God for its own sake, even when adding a second layer of writing over the first, while according to the majority of the rabbis, a scribe cannot do this. So presumably that same dispute would apply here in the bill of divorce, where it was a get that was not written for this particular wife's sake, but now the scribe is going to write over it her name again with the intention that this get is written for her sake. So we would think that based on the earlier dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis about a scribe writing a Torah scroll, that we would have the same dispute here, and perhaps Rabbi Yehuda would validate such a get, but the majority would render it invalid. Now, Rav Acha Bar Yaakov said, well, perhaps that is not so, meaning we cannot apply that earlier dispute about a Torah scroll written with the incorrect intention to a get, because, after all, a Torah scroll and a get are very different kinds of instruments. So says Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, perhaps the rabbis say only there in the case of a Torah scroll that one may not write the name of God in this manner, because it is required that one perform anything sacred, including the writing of a Torah scroll, in accordance with the verse, Exodus 15:2, "This is my God, and I will glorify him." So this verse requires that mitzvahs, that commandments, be performed in a way that is glorious and aesthetically pleasing. And rewriting in this manner is not considered beautiful. But over here, with regard to a get, to a bill of divorce, there is no requirement that a bill of divorce be written in a beautiful manner, and therefore writing over the bill of divorce might be acceptable even according to the rabbis. And that's where we leave off that discussion. So where did the law actually come out? If a bill of divorce was written not for her sake, then even if the scribe traces over it with a reed pen for her, it is invalid. Now, Rav Hisda said, I am able to invalidate all the bills of divorce in the world. Rav Hisda sounds like a bit of a contrary character, and he's saying, listen, if you're going to be very picky, then I will tell you where your pickiness leads, and it might just be that all the bills of divorce that are being written in the world have a fatal flaw, and everybody who thinks they're divorced is not divorced, and everybody with a second marriage that produces children has produced a mamzer. Absolute disaster. So he's probably speaking in a hyperbolic manner. But what is Rav Hisda saying is some kind of potential, but unrealized, flaw with all the bills of divorce in the world. Says Rav Hisda, I am able to invalidate all the bills of divorce in the world. Most bills of divorce are written in a way that they could be declared invalid. If one were to be particular about certain details, then there would be no valid bills of divorce. And Rav has said to him, what are you talking about? What is the reason that you would invalidate them? If we say most bills of divorce are invalid because it is written in the Torah, Deuteronomy 24:1, about the husband writing a get for his wife, it says in the Torah, and he writes her a scroll of severance. And here, in the case of most bills of divorce, she actually writes it for him. Wait, what? What are you saying? You could say, well, the husband, we can validate all the bills of divorce because usually a husband does not write his own bill of divorce. He hires a scribe to do it for him. But says the Gemara, actually, that's not what usually happens. It's not that the husband hires a scribe to write the bill of divorce, as we would obviously expect, because he's the one who has to write it for her and then deliver it to her, and that's when they become divorced. But actually, the way this was done in practice is that the wife hires a scribe to write her own bill of divorce, and then it's given to the husband to sign, witness, etc., and then it gets delivered to her. Why would they do that? I mean, the husband's the breadwinner, and you're gonna, in ancient times, and you're gonna make the wife go and pay for the bill of divorce? Answer, yes. And this is to her advantage because she controls the process. If she's going to wait around for a husband who's potentially a cheapskate, who doesn't want to hire a scribe and is going to keep putting it off, then she might not be able to get out of this marriage, and she might end up being a stranded wife and an aguna. So the scribes, actually, the sages actually instituted as a leniency for the wife that she hires the scribe and writes the get, so she gets it done. Right? It's very interesting. So what the Gemara is asking, is this Rav Hisda's reason? Because the sages instituted that the wife would actually go and get the get drawn up, that therefore it does not really satisfy the requirements of the Torah, that the husband is the one who goes out and hires the scribe and has it written for him? But if that's what you're arguing, well, then it could be maintained that the sages transferred the ownership of the bill of divorce to him. Okay, she had it drawn up by a scribe, but then they give it to the husband so that he can sign it in front of witnesses, etc. And at that time, it becomes his, and so it is his bill of divorce that he is then giving to her. So this little technicality, if that's Rav Hisda's objection to all the gets in the world, it's not going to hold up. So rather, you might say that Rav Hisda's problem with all the gets in the world is because it is written in Deuteronomy 24:1 about the husband giving a get to the wife, that it's written and gives. He gives her the get. Now, if he's giving her a get, right, he's giving her this bill of divorce. Now, you might say that that bill of divorce sort of contains an implied value of a tremendous amount. I mean, she's getting freed from what seems to be a loveless marriage, and, a marriage that needs to end, that it's now come to the end. It's going to be a divorce. That's of great value to her. And because there's going to be a divorce, he's going to owe her the ketubah payment that he promised to pay if he ever divorced her when they got married. So there's all kinds of value that is coming her way. But when you talk about giving the get, the word give, as a legal term in the Torah, the sages have said elsewhere that if you are legally, formally giving something to someone else, then the thing that you are giving has to have a minimum financial value, right? And so you might say, well, I mean, a legal document, you have to pay lawyers a lot of money. You have to pay the scribe a lot of money. But it might be that the actual document on which the get is written is just cheap paper done in a cheap, fast way, and it doesn't actually in itself inherently possess any financial value. And so when you say that he's giving her a get, if he didn't give it to her in a way that the paper, the ink, this thing, the get itself is worth more than the minimum value. And the minimum value is a peruta, which is like a few pennies. I mean, it's not like they're saying so much, but some things are worth even less than a few pennies. So perhaps that's the problem. And here, in the case of most bills of divorce, he doesn't give her anything of value. Now, perhaps the mere giving of the bill of divorce is the giving mentioned in the Torah, even if it does not have monetary value. Know that this is not a requirement. No, K-N-O-W, you should know that it is not a requirement that the bill of divorce have monetary value. As the sages sent this message from the land of Israel, if he wrote a bill of divorce on items from which benefit is forbidden, right? Something from which benefit is forbidden because it's hekdesh, because it belongs to the temple, so no person can derive personal value from it, or it's the subject of a vow that no one may derive value from it. So that object is by definition worthless because it is not worth anything to anybody, even if it's a piece of gold, but it's for whatever reason, because it's been consecrated for use in the temple, or because it's subject to some kind of a vow, which says all the people in the world are prohibited to benefit from it. So this thing has a value of zero. It is by definition has a value of zero. And the sages decreed that even if a get was written on such an object, one that is prohibited for use, nevertheless, the woman becomes divorced when she receives that thing. Now, it's interesting because my question is, well, if the whole world is prohibited to benefit from it, then when he writes a get on it and gives it to the wife, hasn't the couple benefited from it? But that's a question outside of this discussion. Bottom line, you can write a get on any object. No matter how worthless it is, it will still create a valid divorce. Now, the Gemara discusses the matter itself. The sages sent this message from the land of Israel. If he wrote a bill of divorce on items from which benefit is forbidden, the bill of divorce is valid. And Rav Ashi said, we too learn in the Mishna that a bill of divorce may be written even on an olive leaf, which has virtually no monetary value. And this teaches that the bill of divorce need not have any value on its own, and even forbidden items, which have no value at all, may be used as the base on which the bill of divorce is written. Now, the Gemara rejects this, but perhaps an olive leaf is different. Perhaps it can combine with more leaves, and they all add up to have some monetary value. However, an item from which one is prohibited from benefiting lacks value entirely, even in large quantities. And this would seem to indicate that the giving of the get does not mean that an item of value has to be given that the get is written on. Now, with regard to the same law, the Gemara quotes an additional source. It was taught in a baraisa that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, right, usually known as Rebbe, and this is the Tana, the rabbi of the Mishnaic period, the period when the Mishnah was put together, who in fact, he was the editor, the redactor of the Mishnah. So we're talking about that Rebbe, and he was the head of the Sanhedrin in his generation. So we're talking about the Mishnah was redacted around the year 200 of the Common Era. So Rebbe says, if the scribe wrote a bill of divorce on items from which benefit is forbidden, it is valid. That's what we've just said several times. Now, Levi, who was one of the sages of that period and a student of Rebbe, went out and expounded upon this law in the name of Rebbe. And they did not praise him, like they said he was doing something wrong. So he then expounded this law in the name of the majority as an unattributed law. And then they praised him. So apparently the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rebbe. Therefore, when he stated the law in the name of Rebbe, an individual, which may have led the listeners to think that it was not a majority opinion, right? In other words, it was the accepted majority opinion. It might be that Rebbe came up with it. It might be that Rebbe agrees with it. But when the sages were transmitting a law from one to another, if they stated it in the name of an individual, they needed to be careful to also establish whether that had become the law or not. Because often when a law is stated in the name of an individual, it means that that was his minority opinion and the majority disagreed with him, right? And this is a majority opinion. That even a get written on a prohibited item is still a valid get. Now the sages taught that it is said in the Torah with regard to a get, and he writes her a scroll of severance. And it says this in order to emphasize that one must write the document and not chisel it, right? He writes her a get. Now, he may hire a scribe, the husband may hire a scribe to do it, but the get needs to be a written object, right? The scribe has to write it, literally write it. So what if he chiseled it, right? This husband is so happy to get out of his marriage that he has it engraved on a tablet of stone. Is that a valid get? The Gemara asks, is this to say that chiseling is not writing? And the Gemara raises a contradiction based on what was taught in a baraisa. If a slave is emancipated through a bill of manumission, this is also called a get shikra, I believe. But at any rate, as we've seen several times, that there are similarities, they're not the same, but there are similarities between a husband giving his wife a get, which ends their marriage, and in the times when there was slavery, a master giving the slave a bill of manumission, which frees the slave. All right, so it's taught in a baraisa. If a slave is emancipated through a bill of manumission that was written by being chiseled on a slate or on a tablet, then the slave goes free. However, he does not go free through writing on a cap or an embroidered adornment. If the master embroidered the bill of manumission onto a cloth and gave it to the slave, this is not considered to be like the writing of a document. In any case, the Baraisa teaches that a bill of manumission that is chiseled onto a slate is valid. Now, where they're going with this is, if you sew, like if you embroider the writing of a get, you didn't really write something. But if you chiseled it into a piece of stone, then that is considered writing. And where they're going to go now is to say, well, let's say that you, instead of chiseling the writing into the stone, right, by making like sort of little, channels through the stone that leave the writing, that have the form of writing, what if you chiseled away all of the extra stone and you left raised letters? The effect would be that on a piece of stone, you could read the writing of the get. But you didn't write it. You chiseled away stone that left the written word there. And that's actually going to be distinguished from chiseling in the letters, right? So if you carve out the letters by running the chisel in the pattern of the letters, that's considered writing. But if you chisel away all the other rock and leave raised letters on the stone, that's not going to be considered writing. Quite interesting. Ula said that Rabbi Lazar said, this is not difficult. This case where the document is not valid because engraving is not considered to be writing. This occurs when the scribe chiseled away the area surrounding the letters, leaving raised letters. And the Baraisa that teaches that chiseling is like writing is where he carved away the letters themselves. Now the Gemara asks, and if he chiseled the area surrounding the letters, is this not considered to be writing at all? And the Gemara raises a contradiction based on what was taught. The writing of the tzitz, right? So that was the front plate that the high priest wore on his forehead when he was serving as the high priest in the temple. And this was a gold plate that he wore on his forehead. And on it said the words, holy to Hashem, right? Holy to God. Now those letters, were they engraved inward on that plate? No, they were embossed outward. Like the letters popped out of the plate. The letters stood out from the plate. So are we going to say that that's not considered writing because the letters were raised rather than engraved into the plate? the writing of the high priest's front plate was not embedded. It was not carved into the front plate. Rather, it protruded like the form of on gold dinar coins. And isn't the shape on gold dinars formed by chiseling the area surrounding the letters, by applying pressure around the shape so that the image and writing protrudes, and yet this is considered to be writing, right? If you think about a coin, right, what does a coin do? Like, they press down the metal around the letters, and the letters end up standing up, right, above the flat plane in the negative spaces of the coin's image and writing. So the Gemara answers, and so are you going to say that this is not writing on the front plate? And the Gemara answers, it means that the front plate was fashioned like the form of gold dinars, but not entirely like the form of gold dinars. It was fashioned like the form of gold dinars in that the writing protrudes from the front plate. But it was not like gold dinars entirely, as there, in the case of gold dinars, they pressed down the metal around the letters. But when they fabricated the front plate, they actually sort of chiseled into the plate from behind so that the letters would stick out in front. Now, with regard to this issue, Ravina said to Rav Ashi, does the press that forms a metal coin carve out the background in the metal and the image of the coin is formed on its own? Or does it compress the metal inward toward the empty space in the press and the letters are formed through this? And he said to him, it carves out the background. So he raised an objection to his opinion based on what was taught earlier. The writing of the high priest's front plate was not embedded, rather it protruded like the form of gold coins. And if it enters your mind to say that a press only carves out the background, isn't there a need to write it? As the verse states, with regard to the front plate of the high priest, wrote upon it a writing like the engravings of a signet. And there is no writing here. So the Gemara answers, it means that the front plate was fashioned like a coin and that the letters stood out, but it wasn't created like coins are created. Coins are pressed where the metal around the letters gets pressed down, but the front plate was created by, sort of chiseling from behind the front plate so that the letters would stand out in front. Now we're on 20b. Rava raised a dilemma before Rav Nachman in the case of a husband who wrote for his wife, a bill of divorce on a plate of gold. And he said to her, receive your bill of divorce and also receive payment of your marriage contract through this act, meaning the piece of gold on which the get is engraved. Very interesting. So what is the law? Are they divorced? And has she received the payment of her ketubah, the payment of that he promised to pay if they were ever divorced? It's very interesting because if you say that they are divorced, and I think we're going to expect that they would be divorced because we've just spent over and over and over again saying, well, you can write the get on anything as long as it's a valid act of writing, and here it's chiseled, indented into the gold, so that's considered a valid act of writing. And if you're going to say that it's an amount of gold that is her ketubah payment, so now it's like the husband is saying, okay, we're done, we're square, we're divorced, I paid you all in one go, boom, let's go. You go your way, I go mine. The only issue is, what's she going to do with this get made out of gold, so that she can actually use it to live off, right? To actually use the money, the monetary worth of that get. She's going to have to melt it down and sell it, and then she won't have the document. That would be the issue. So is it a valid divorce? Has he paid the ketubah? What's the answer? Rav Nachman said her bill of divorce has been received and the payment of her marriage contract has been received, right? So it does count. It works. I guess what you could say is when he did this, there were witnesses. And when it was given to her, there were witnesses. And if it was such an extraordinary act as a get literally printed on a piece of gold, an expensive piece of gold, then you would think that witnesses would remember this and be able to testify about it later. Maybe she could also, actually use this engraved metal to make a print, right? Like print it, just as evidence of what was once given. I don't know, but at any rate, it counts. Rava raised an objection to his statement from a baraisa. If a husband gave his wife a bill of divorce on an oversized paper, and he said to her, here's your bill of divorce, and the remainder of the paper on which nothing is written is designated for the payment of your marriage contract. Well, then her bill of divorce has been received, and the remainder should be for the payment of her marriage contract. I guess they weren't very wealthy people with a very expensive ketubah. If you're telling me that he wrote it on a really big piece of paper, and in one corner is the writing of the get, and the rest of the paper actually satisfies his obligation to pay her marriage contract. On the other hand, you could say, well, this might be a roll of very expensive paper. It might be a roll of, the kind of parchment that's used for a Torah scroll. And it might indeed be a very valuable roll of paper. And the ketubah is just on one little part of it. And the rest of it is an item of real value that could be used to satisfy his obligation. It seems like it would work. Now, the Gemara explains how this teaching is an objection to the get made out of gold. Now, this indicates that the reason why the material upon which the bill of divorce is written may also serve as the payment for her marriage contract is that there is the remainder of the paper on which the bill of divorce was not written. If there is not the remainder of the paper, then no, perhaps the bill of divorce may not serve as payment of the marriage contract. In other words, the get made out of gold, the whole piece of gold has the get on it. Right? It's not like the get is just one little corner of it and the rest of the gold is what she could use. For her to use that gold to live off is going to be to destroy the get. So maybe that's a reason why it might work in terms of this big roll of paper with the get written on a little part of it, but maybe it won't work with the get made out of gold. And so this is because the husband must give the bill of divorce to his wife for it to become hers. So if so, even if the bill of divorce was written on a plate of gold, if there was no part of the plate of gold other than the space where the bill of divorce was written, maybe it will not serve as payment of her marriage contract. But in fact, it does work. Here's the halacha. If a man engraved a bill of divorce onto a plate of gold and he gave it to her and he said, behold, this is your bill of divorce and the payment of your marriage contract, then she is divorced. And her marriage contract is paid up to the value of the plate in accordance with Rav Nachman's statement. However, if the husband did not state that it should also be for the payment of her marriage contract, then she acquires the gold plate merely as a bill of divorce, and the husband still owes the ketubah payment. So it's only going to count as the ketubah payment if he says he wants it to count as the ketubah payment. Otherwise, it's just a very expensive document. Now, Rav Nachman said, the same is true for the get written on the big roll of paper as on the plate of gold. The same is true, although there is no remainder of the paper, and he wrote the bill of divorce on the entire paper. And by stating the law in a case where there was an additional part of the paper, the Baraisa teaches us this: although there is the remainder of the paper upon which nothing is written, if he explicitly said to her that it should be for the payment of her marriage contract, yes, it is considered to be payment of her marriage contract. If he did not say this explicitly, then no, it is not for the payment of her marriage contract. It is merely a document. He has to state that. The husband has to state that. If the document itself is so valuable that it can be used to pay the marriage payment, he has to state that that's his intention, or he merely gave her a document. Now, the Gemara explains what is the reason for this. If the husband did not explicitly say that the remainder of the paper is designated toward the payment of the marriage contract, then the remainder is considered to be the margin around the border of the scroll, and all of the paper constitutes the bill of divorce. Therefore, it is necessary to inform her that the remainder of the paper is for the payment of the marriage contract. Now, the sages taught, if the husband said to his wife, behold, this is your get, but the paper on which it is written is still mine. Oh, can he do that? This is your get, but I'm not giving you the paper. So what's he giving her? He's giving her the ink, but she can't keep it? What? Let's see. The sages taught, if the husband said to his wife, behold, this is your get, but the paper on which it is written is still mine, then she is not divorced, as he must give her the actual bill of divorce in order for the divorce to take effect. Since the paper still belongs to him, it is as if he had given her only the writing. But if he said to her, behold, this is your bill of divorce on the condition that you return the paper to me, then she is divorced. The bill of divorce belongs entirely to her, and the returning of the paper later is only a stipulation that must be fulfilled, but she has already become divorced. Rav Papa raises a dilemma. If the husband said that the paper between each line or between each word in the bill of divorce will still belong to him, but the paper where the words are written will be hers, what is the law? And a solution is not found for this question, and the dilemma shall stand. Taiku. Here is one of those obvious examples where it is purely a hypothetical for the exercise of having us understand what the law is. I mean, it's just, there's no husband that ever gave a wife a get and said, I want you to return the paper between the words to me. Like what she's supposed to do, cut out the words, glue it like a ransom note from kidnappers on a magazine, and return those other bits of paper to him. Did that ever happen? I mean, I suppose it was some vindictive jerk who tried it, but I don't think so. And plus, he wouldn't gain anything by it because the dilemma stands. But the point is, they're trying to understand, testing the limits of the principle. It's really an intellectual exercise when questions like that are being asked. That doesn't mean that they're unimportant questions. It's testing whether we understand the underlying principle. That is very important. Now, the Gemara asks, why isn't a solution offered for Rav Papa's question? Let him derive an answer to this question from elsewhere, as the Merciful One speaks of one scroll in regard to the bill of divorce in the Torah, where it says, and he writes for her a scroll of severance. And the Torah did not mention multiple scrolls. He says he writes for her a scroll of severance. So if he's demanding that she cut out the paper in between the words and give that back to him, well, then the words are going to be loose and they're going to be written on multiple scrolls. He was supposed to give her a scroll of severance, not scrolls of severance. So this ought to indicate that he cannot do that. But the Gemara answers, no, it is necessary to discuss the question in a case where the letters are intertwined, meaning that they were written in such a manner that even if the paper between them was removed, the writing in the bill of divorce would remain attached as a single entity. He wanted holes cut out of the get and the paper on the blank paper returned to him, but the get itself, though full of holes, literally, would still be legible. So is this a valid get? Rami Bar Chama raises a dilemma. If the judges had a presumption that a slave belonged to the husband, and the bill of divorce that this man gave his wife was written on the slave's hand, and now the slave emerges from her possession, i.e. he is with the woman, so what is the law with regard to this bill of divorce? So first we have to understand, and we already saw this in the Mishna, that you can write the bill of divorce on anything, even a living thing. You can't write it on a leaf that's still attached to a tree, but you can write it on the side of a cow. You can write it on the horn of a cow, a living cow that's walking around, and you could even write it on the hand of a slave. So what they're really asking here is not, can you write a get on the hand of a slave? The answer is yes. But remember that you have to give to her the document. So now that it's written on the hand of a slave, you have to give her the slave for this to be the valid giving of a get that produces divorce. So what they're saying is, okay, well, he wrote the get on the hand of the slave, and now the slave lives with her. So it must be that the husband gave her the get. And the answer is going to be, no, it's not that it must be that. We don't know that that's what happened. Because a slave has free will. He might be a slave, whose liberties are curtailed by the fact that he's a slave under the laws of slavery in the ancient world, but he's still a living person who has his own free will. and he might have walked over to her house because he would rather, after the divorce, be living with her. And maybe, if he sticks with her, that's what is going to end up happening. Maybe he ran away from his master, who's the husband, and now he's sheltering with her. Bottom line, because he's a living person, in fact, this also counts for animals, you can't assume that because somebody has possession either of a slave or of a chicken or of a cow or of any living thing, you can't assume that because they have possession that there is a presumption of ownership. Because animals and of course slaves walk around and can do things on their own. So the fact that the husband wrote it on the slave's hand and now the slave lives with her does not allow us to assume that he gave her the slave, right? He would have to give her the slave if in fact he's writing the get on the slave's hand, and so there would need to be witnesses of that act of giving. The Gemara explains the elements of the question. Do we say that the husband transferred the slave to his wife? Therefore, it is as though he gave her the bill of divorce in the proper manner, as is explained in the Mishna, and she is divorced. Or perhaps we say that he, the slave, entered the possession of the woman on his own because he prefers to be under her ownership rather than under the husband's ownership, in which case the husband did not legally give the slave to the woman, and because the get is written on the slave's hand, he did not give the get to the woman, and she is not divorced. So which is it? Rava said, and let Rami Bar Chama derive an answer to his question from a different reason, that writing on a person's body is writing that can be forged, as it is easily erased and replaced with other writing. And a bill of divorce that is written in a manner that is susceptible to forgery is invalid. And the Gemara clarifies, but according to Rava, who raised this challenge, the Mishnah is difficult as it is taught that a bill of divorce may be written on the hand of a slave. So the Gemara responds, granted, the Mishnah is not difficult for Rava, as it is possible to say that the Mishnah is referring to a case where the husband gave her the slave with witnesses present who observed the transmission of a legal document. In other words, they were present when the slave, who has the legal document written on him, was given to the woman. And it is in accordance with Rabbi Elazar, who holds that the essential witnesses are those who witness the delivery. And since they witnessed the delivery, she is divorced. However, for Rami Bar Chama, it is difficult. In this case, there were no witnesses to the transfer of the slave, so the possibility that the writing was forged should invalidate it. The Gemara answers, well, according to Rami Bar Chama, it is also not difficult, as we shall say that the writing was not written in ink, but rather it was a tattoo. So if it was a tattoo on the slave of a hand, then it is not easily forged. We do away with that objection. We still have the problem that there were not witnesses at the transfer, and so we cannot assume that the husband gave her the slave just because she now has possession of the slave, because the slave might have gone there of his own free will and was not given by the husband. And that is analogous to livestock. Come in here a proof based on that which Reish Lakish says. With regard to livestock, there is no presumption of ownership, since they wander from place to place. Therefore, a person cannot claim that his mere possession of livestock demonstrates ownership. Now, let me just say in a very quick aside that we are soon in our journey, I mean, not so soon, but probably 6 months to a year, coming into Bava Metzia, kind of this centerpiece tractate in the Talmud, which is actually where young students, like kids, begin studying Talmud when they go to yeshiva. And the classic opening for people to start studying Talmud is on the first page of Bava Metzia, where it says, two people come to the rabbinic court, come before the Beis Din, holding on to a piece of cloth. They usually say a talis, a prayer shawl. And both of them say, it's mine, right? And then we go into all kinds of permutation where there is permutations of cases of disputed ownership. Now, we have a popular saying in America, possession is 9/10 of the law. Under Talmudic law, I wouldn't say it's 9/10 of the law, but possession goes a long way. The fact that you have it speaks volumes about whether you're supposed to have it or not. Now, the other one could say he stole it from me, and he might have to bring witnesses to prove that. But the one who has possession of it is definitely in a superior possession. If the item in question is livestock, possession does not go very far at all because livestock wander about. And that is what Reish Lakish is saying here. With regard to livestock, there is no presumption of ownership because they wander from place to place. Therefore, a person cannot claim that his mere possession of livestock demonstrates ownership because the livestock may have wandered onto his property on their own. Now, the same law should apply to the slave in this case where the get was written on the hand of the slave. If there are no witnesses who saw the transfer of the slave from the husband to the wife, then the fact that she possesses the slave should not serve as proof that the slave, and by extension the get, which was written on his hand, was given to her by the husband. The formal requirement that the get be given to her has not been satisfied. There's no evidence of that just from the fact that the slave is living in her home. Now, Rami Bar Chama raises another dilemma. If the judges had a presumption that a slate, right, like a slate, like a little blackboard, was hers, and a bill of divorce was written on it, and now this slate emerges from his possession, and he wants to divorce his wife by giving her the slate, what is the law? Do we say that she transferred the ownership of the slate to him and he may give it to her as a bill of divorce and the divorce takes effect? Or perhaps a woman does not understand how to transfer an object that will be given back to her and she believes it is merely a formality and not an actual legal transfer. If this were the case, they would not be divorced as the slate did not in fact belong to the husband so that he could give it to her. Now remember, where we started in this discussion is that the sages at one point decreed that the wife would hire the scribe and have the get written. Then they said as a legal formality that when the wife does that and then they give the get to the husband so that he can sign in front of witnesses, they have given it to him. Now it's his. It is his. He owns the get while he's signing it in front of witnesses. And then when he gives it back to the wife, it doesn't matter that she had it written, that she at one time owned it. It was his when he set out to give it to her so that it is a valid and proper act of giving. And here they're asking the same question. If she says, okay, let's write the get on this little slate, write it out, she says to the scribe, and now let's give that slate to the husband. And what they're saying is, well, does she understand that she's giving it to the husband? It's not her slate. She's not lending it to him. She's not just putting it in his hand so that he can give it back to her. She's giving him the slate so that he can give it back to her. Now, Rav Nachman responded, the same is true, although there is no remainder of the paper. Right. Abaye said, come in here a proof based on that which is stated in a Mishna in Tractate Eduyot. Even he, Rabbi Yehuda ben Baba, who was quoted earlier in this Mishnah, testified about a small village that was adjacent to Jerusalem. And there was an old man there who would lend money to all the residents of the village. And he would write documents in his handwriting, and others would sign. And the incident came before the sages, and they deemed it valid. And why did they deem it valid? Isn't there a need to fulfill this verse from Jeremiah 32:11? I took the deed of purchase, which means that the document itself must be transferred from the seller to the buyer. And this is not the case here, as the document attesting to the loan was in the possession of the creditor the entire time. Right? This old man is lending money to people. So he gives them the money. And I guess he's giving them a contract, which says that they have to pay him back. But then he holds the contract. Or maybe they need to give him a promissory note saying that they're going to pay it back. But he never gave them the paper for them to give it back to him. In other words, there's some legality here that's not being satisfied because the one who is lending money is doing all the writing and holding all the documentation. There's no giving of documents. And yet the sages deemed that valid. So rather, is it not because we say that this man certainly did transfer the ownership of the documents to them, to the people who were borrowing money, in a legally binding manner, although he knew that they would be returned to him immediately afterward. I mean, he knew what the legality was, so even though he's holding the documents, what he said was, I'm giving these people the document and they're giving it back to me. There's two transfers, and now it's in that, therefore, when they give it to me, it's a valid transfer of the document. And Rava said, and what is the difficulty? How can one prove anything from the Mishnah? Perhaps a knowledgeable old man is different, as he understands the need to transfer the documents, and this may not be true in the case of the wife who takes her own slate and then she might think she's just lending it to the man rather than giving it to him so he can give it back. Lending it and having it returned means she's not divorced. Giving him the slate with the get written on it and then him giving it back to her means that she is divorced. And if she doesn't understand that, then we run the risk that it was not a valid divorce. So rather, Rava said a proof may be brought from here. If there was a guarantor whose commitment emerged after the promissory note was signed, then the creditor may collect only from the guarantor's unsold property. However, he does not have a lien on the guarantor's property with which he could collect from property sold after that person signed as a guarantor. And Rava's proof is that it must be that ownership of the promissory note was transferred to the guarantor before he signed it in order for his commitment to take effect. It may therefore be seen from this baraisa in the example of a guarantor who steps in after a promissory note was written, that the participants understand the need to transfer ownership of the document. And Rav Ashi said, what is the difficulty raised by this baraisa? Perhaps a man is different in that he understands the need to transfer the document. And the question of the Gemara pertains to a woman who maybe not be spending enough time with lawyers and scribes and rabbinic courts, and she doesn't actually technically know that when she gives this slate to her husband so that he can give it back to her with a get written on it, that she had to give it to him and then he gives it back, and that she wasn't lending it. And if she didn't have that right understanding and that right intention, that she's not really divorced. That's what we're worried about. So you can't compare to this old man who made loans or to this case of the creditor and the guarantor on a loan, because those are more sophisticated financial type people. Rav Ashi said, okay, here's a proof from what was taught in this tractate on page 22b. A woman may write her bill of divorce on her own or allow a scribe to write it on her behalf and then give it to her husband so that he will give it to her. Similarly, a man may write his receipt that he will receive from the woman after paying her marriage contract, as the ratification of a bill of divorce is only through its signatories, i.e. the witnesses who sign it. And the mere writing of the document or its receipt has no legal ramifications and may be done by anyone. So in any case, it is clear from here that a woman understands the need to transfer the bill of divorce that will be given to her by the husband in the future, and we don't have to worry that she didn't have the correct understanding of this transfer of documentation. It's irrelevant. And the divorce is good as long as a get was validly written and delivered to her in front of witnesses. And that's what I have for us today. Let's see if there were some questions or comments. Google Documents making me sign in. Okay. Aoife, question. If the husband wrote the get on the wife's slave whom she already owns, did the husband give the wife the get? What a good question. I would say that only if she understood she was giving the slave to the husband so that he could write the get on the slave's hand, and then he gave the slave back to her. Otherwise, it would not work. So you understood it. Sharon, my recollection of a ketubah of old is that the terms are very specific of terms, say in livestock or produce, is the assumption that the value can be transferred into a monetary or gold sum. So Sharon is asking if the ketubah specified that she goes out of the marriage with something other, particular, something that is specified and which is other than money. and then the husband just gives the monetary value of those objects. Or for example, she came into the marriage with fields worth a certain amount, and then the husband wanted to keep the fields and he just gave her money instead of the fields that she brought in. Has he satisfied the obligations of the ketubah? I would say in terms of real property, no way. He can't turn that into money. In terms of movable property, maybe, but I'm not sure. Good question. Bill, this question of chiseling as writing raises a vital modern question. What effect does this have on printed gets as opposed to written by a scribe? I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to guess that when you're talking about a get in the modern world, it is not printed. It actually has to be written by a scribe. There might be a form which allows, some of the information on the form can be printed, but the actual get, the part of the get that is the functional part of the get, does have to be written, literally written. And Joe, that golden get is an evil treatment of his wife. Does his desire to have the get count as payment in full have to be written on it? Yes, exactly. So that you must have asked that question before they later said it, that the husband has to specify that this is also payment of the ketubah payment, or the golden get is just a very valuable document and he still owes the amount that he owes under the ketubah. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, Tuesday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.